Tonight we are excited. One of the works that our team does is finding amazing guest speakers to join us, and Jamel helped with our connection to tonight's guest. And tonight we are joined by Nevada Littlewolf. Nevada joins us from the upper north, the great state of Minnesota. Nevada serves as the Page Amendment campaign manager and the executive director. Nevada served as the state political director for the 2020 Biden-Harris presidential campaign. She has years of experience in political work, ranging from working in her local community, government, philanthropy, nonprofit, and business. Nevada served on the Virginia City Council, that is located in the state of Minnesota, for 10 years from the year 2008 to 2018. And Nevada is also a citizen of the Leech Lake Nation and has 2 children. She also serves as the board chair and trustee of the Women's Foundation of Minnesota, and then serves on the board of the Minnesota Urban Debate League. And so, Nevada, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And please feel free to expand on that introduction. And we'd love to hear a brief word from you before we start our Q&A.
Wes Miigwech, thank you. That was a great introduction. Anin, Makunsin Indigenous Cause, Makwa Dudayim, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Unjaba. So just giving a greeting in my Ojibwe language, that my name is Nevada Littlewolf. I'm joining you here tonight from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I am a member of the Wolf Clan. Really excited to be here. There's a lot to talk about. I'm very passionate about rural issues, and so I'm just really excited to get the conversation started.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And just a little insight to everyone else. When Jamel and I first met Nevada virtually over Zoom, we were talking about the book, and Nevada loved what she heard about it, and immediately purchased the book and has been reading it and has been spreading Jane's book with rural organizers there that she knows. And so cool to just see that. And we're just excited for you all to get to hear about her experiences and perspectives. So first off, Nevada, what was the catalyst for you to get involved politically? When did that happen? Was there one moment, a series of moments, but what spurred you to get involved in politics?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So as a citizen of Leech Lake Nation, I will say that I'm probably one of the most legislated people in the country, in that I am a citizen of my sovereign tribal nation, a citizen of my local community, the state of Minnesota, and then the country. And so whether I like it or not, whether I did like it or not, politics is just a part of my daily life and being. And I was a young person. I was in art school, and I was really pretty passionate about creativity and art. I probably didn't ever imagine that I'd be doing the work that I'm doing, but very quickly became a part of community decisions, and particularly related to the American Indian community, and advocating for myself, my family, and my community. And that's really what opened the door for me into doing this type of work.
Awesome. And you mentioned art, and we're just curious, how have you used art in political organizing, or what skills as an artist have helped you as a political organizer?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things. Like when I first ran for city council, I knew that my representation on that council was very unique. I was the only woman, I was the only person under the age of 60, I was the only person who had school-age children, but also just from a professional background. I mean, I had been doing work with children primarily, but then as an artist. And what one of my artist friends, talked to me about was the need for someone like me to be on the city council, to bring creativity into that space, to think differently, to bring new ideas. Like so many times we'd have conversations on that council where people would say, well, we tried that, we did that, it didn't work, or we know how to do this, we do it this way. And really not being able to break out of sort of that locked in place and thinking about things differently and thinking about things in a new way. And I think that my arts background really helped me with that.
Mm.
And
And
then, and
oh, go
just
ahead.
in terms of, yeah, in terms of like organizing, any campaign that I'm organizing, I'm making sure that we're bringing an artist perspective into it. So like the page amendment that I'm working on right now, we had a poet write a spoken word piece for our campaign. We have visual artists that are creating graphics for our campaign, and we're making sure that we're lifting up those artist voices from the community in the campaign, because we know that people need to be touched in their heart and they need to be moved into action, and they need to be able to see that in different ways.
Mm, mm. I I love that last piece, and just making sure people's hearts are touched with politics, because politics is personal. And when we run campaigns or organizations in a personal way, it's going to let people know that impact that politics has on our everyday life. And so, and you briefly touched on the fact, like, that your work began, as you're standing up for your individual rights, your family's rights, your tribe's rights. And I know part of your story is working with women who want to run for office. And so, we listened to that great song to get us started here by Joan Jett, Bad Reputation. And so could you just expand, why was that your choice to greet folks as they came to join us tonight?
This is going to sound crazy, but one time back in 2008 in Bois Forte Tribal Nation, during a snowstorm, a blizzard, we gathered 150 rural women together to talk about running for public office. And we had to think of ways to like get people to get up and move around. You're in a conference. This is like, we really struggle with this now on the Zoom world, right? But there for a conference for 2 days, we're like, what are we going to do to get people to get up and move around? And so we had a little in between sessions, we did air guitar, and every woman had to stand up and do their best air guitar impersonation to Joan Jett's Bad Reputation. And it really helped us like get the women in the room to kind of like let go of these fears that they have and like move their body. And we had people, we had the steel workers, the union woman from the steel workers. We had a very, we talk about bridging, right, between urban and rural. We had a very wealthy woman who was in her high heels and her lipstick. We had Winona LaDuke. We had Anne Bancroft. We had all of these women from all over the state air guitaring together. And it was just such a bonding moment and so much fun. Additionally, I think just the song Bad Reputation by Joan Jett is something that women, when you step into political leadership, there's always that assessment that you have to do about, what is this going to mean for me? How is it going to change my life? What am I worried about as I step into public leadership? And anyway, so when I think of bad reputation, I'm just like, I don't care about my bad reputation, because it's more important that we're out there standing for what we believe in. If you're going to ask me for a quote, I'd give you the quote from Audre Lorde, where she talks about it is more important, it is more important for me to basically to speak my truth than whether I am afraid. And I think that those are really kind of important things to understand, is that, we have to be out there speaking up on behalf of things. And it does matter less and less whether you're afraid, and you shouldn't get worried about these ideas that somehow there's some, something that someone's going to find out about you, and then it's going to be a bad thing. Most things are just kind of, they're not real anyway. Like they're not things that people really care about. Mostly people are concerned about who are you and what do you bring and what do you care about in terms of your issues and your values and your vision.
Yeah. And I love that, because here at Bridge is we really focus on communicating values. And if we focus on the values piece, the rest will take care of itself, whether it's, you know, how, you know, there's so much diversity in the Democratic Party and how we want to tackle certain issues. There can be differences, but ultimately we share the same value, and that's so important. And so I love that from you. And you know, you have played so many roles in your life, from volunteer to activist to, you know, working on a presidential campaign, to being a politician yourself. And you know, and you've talked, you know, briefly, just as women, some of the you know, things that maybe hold folks back from getting involved. And so I just want to hear from you, you know, like, can you speak to you know, what struggles did you uh encounter, and then what successes did you encounter as you navigated those various roles, from activist to politician to working on a campaign staff?
Well, I think for me, I had to take that personal inventory and determine like what were the things I was worried about, and what were the things that I was interested in being a part of in terms of community leadership. And I know some things that I thought about, a lot about, were my children, who at the time were, my son was in the second grade and my daughter was early childhood age. Like I think she might have been in kindergarten at that point. Also, my daughter has Down syndrome. So I worried about whether, you know, like that my children were protected, I think was first and foremost in terms of me stepping into a leadership role. Like my number one role was really making sure that I was a good parent and a good mother. But I think that in terms of like the successful things, you know, there's a quote in the book in the beginning part, the introduction, and it talks about it's more likely that rural Democrats win at the local level where you can create change faster. And in Nebraska, they had 850 Democrats run, 73% of them won their elections, and none of those were statewide and none of them were federal offices, right? So when you think about that, like the number of like the impact that you can have in the community that you're in a local race, I think that that is something that is hugely transformation, like hugely transformational. And for me, I mean, the local office and the city council was where I wanted to be. Like, I didn't want to be down at the Capitol. I didn't want to be running for a state office or a federal office. I wanted to be in my community where I could see the changes happening and where I could talk with other community members about what was going on. The other thing that I really liked about local office was that it was nonpartisan. So I didn't have to declare whether I was a Republican or a Democrat or anything in between. People knew, right? Like people had some sense of where I stood on things, but it wasn't a requirement for the office to make that declaration. And I think that that was actually really, to me, felt really good because we could get to work on issues without getting like gridlocked into like these partisan issues. I mean, and like I said, we all, of course, could figure out where we fell on the spectrum. I mean, I was over here and everyone else was on the other side. But in terms of getting things done, we were able to like work towards solutions and then see those solutions right in front of us. If, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, and I no, it you definitely did. And you know, and you kind of focused on the politician side, you know. Could you just kind of speak to what challenges, successes have you encountered as an activist, grassroots organization? Because that's what mainly how most of us here tonight identify. And so yeah, just curious to hear about that side as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about the work I've done, you know, I started out pretty young, actually founding a youth organization and taking American Indian youth out to DC, helping them understand what community organizing is. We were part of a national, it was called Unity, United National Indian Tribal Youth. You know, that was a really great way to get young people involved and engaged in an understanding about systems change and how they can advocate for themselves and how they can create change in their community through through that more of a community organizing. I mean, I've done work with Wellstone Action where we've trained fellows around engagement and helping them understand how does the machine work. And these fellows were all BIPOC people, right? Black, Indigenous, people of color. And the fellowship program was designed specifically for these communities who have been marginalized and left out. And so I think, really the work that I have done, the mission that I've taken in my life is really to work with Indigenous communities, women, working on behalf of children, BIPOC communities, and then thinking about policy through a cultural lens, right? So one of the other things I've done is I've worked on tobacco policy here in Minnesota, where we went into tribal communities to do tobacco cessation work. But instead of saying, you must all quit smoking, wagging our finger at them and shaming them about their addiction to commercial tobacco, what we did is we talked about how tobacco is a traditional medicine and tobacco is sacred to our people. And in doing that, we were able to really take a cultural perspective, bring that cultural perspective into a policy solution, and then enact policy across tribes in Minnesota around, instead of saying tobacco-free zone, it would say commercial tobacco-free zone, traditional tobacco is welcome. And then also to help people in communities learn how to grow tobacco again and how to take care of that sacred medicine and how to tend that in a way that would help them overcome their commercial tobacco addiction. So, I mean, the way that I approach work is really, it's from those spaces of understanding who I choose to work for, because there's a lot of work to be done, like a lot of work to be done. And so for me, I kind of have a litmus test or like, a screening process that I just sort of do in my mind around, does this meet the things that I care about or the things that I want to have impact in the world? And if it checks the boxes, then I give it serious consideration. If it doesn't check the boxes, I will, respectfully decline and maybe, refer to someone else who I know maybe is is good to work on that issue.
Thank you for that. And it's kind of a good segue into a question I had for you, because Jane writes, I believe it's in chapter 2, healing the distrust our party has left on communities of color in rural towns across our country is necessary and possible. And so obviously many of us here are grassroots organizers. So what can we do to heal that distrust with communities of color, but then also just with rural towns as well? So kind of both of those two entities.
It's a big question. It's a really big question. In Minnesota, our rural communities are largely white communities. We don't see as much diversity in our rural areas. I mean, I think the tribes represent a lot of the diversity that you'll see across the state. And then we have pockets of towns that maybe have higher populations of certain groups of people. But I think that, knowing that most of rural areas are white, it's that white folks and white organizers really have to do work for themselves to understand racial equity and the history in this country, and to have a real deep and serious and honest approach for themselves to do that work. And if you can do that work, you're going to be in a much better position to work with communities of color, Indigenous people. I think if you don't do that work and you think that you're going to just go and talk to them and ask them to do things for you, you're not going to be very successful. I think additionally, like I said, in Minnesota, we have a lot of tribes. If you've never visited a tribal nation, if you've never gone to a cultural community gathering, if you've never sat down and engaged in a conversation with a Native person, it's going to be really hard for you to try to do any effective organizing in those communities, because you haven't taken the time to do the work. And like, you really have to take time and build relationships. It's just like any other organizing you're doing. You really have to take that time and build those relationships. but I know like I run into this all the time with really well-intended, well-meaning people, really good friends of mine who just, they'll call me and they'll say, hey, we got to reach the Native community. So can you do this for us? And I just tell them, no, like, I can't do that for you. And you've got to do that work yourself. And it's not appropriate for you to call me and ask me to do that work for you. So I think that that's, that's where like really understanding your relationships and doing that hard work with people and community and understanding their history and understanding their struggles is going to be a really big part of that.
Yeah, and that's what Jane really talked about I think it is chapter 2 where she talks about the unlikely alliance and how she admitted, I had no interactions with indigenous people and in any space of work. And so when she first got involved, she was very hesitant, like, am I going to say the wrong things? Am I going to have differences of understanding in terms of cultural behaviors and whatnot? And so what she said her strategy is she just first showed up and listened. And then as she continued to do that, she had individuals who, she learned a lot from, and she said she's still learning. But yeah, great point. And I really like that focus on building relationships, because any and all political organizing cannot be transactional, especially if we want to rebuild that trust with marginalized communities that have been hurt by our party. And so, and kind of on that same note, in that same chapter, Jane mentions, that unlikely alliance and how, as she was working to stop the Keystone XL pipeline coming from Canada down into the States, she herself was surprised by, predominantly white rural towns working side by side with tribal nations. And so curious, what do you think about, is unlikely alliance an appropriate term? Is that not a surprise to you? Can you kind of speak to those two different communities working together? Or
Yeah.
not?
Yeah. I mean, I can talk about it a little bit. I don't think that it's a monolith, right? Like I think that it, depends on the situation, but a lot of small communities that border tribal nations, which from a tribal nation perspective, we call them border cities. They benefit from our economy, or like the economy that the tribes create. So in Minnesota, like the economic development things that are going on in tribes, the communities around benefit from. So when we have, let's say, Bois Fort Resort and Casino and Golf Course, that actually employs more non-native people than native people. And it's a huge economic driver around the Lake Vermilion area. And so helping people to really understand like that there is a, there's a relationship there that's really important for the economy and for the community. We had a state senator who left the DFL party in the last year. And he is sort of like saying he's independent, but he's been doing Republican fundraisers. And this really has a lot to do with his support of mining, a mining project in that region. And it's a copper nickel mining project, and Native people and others really oppose it because it's never been tested to be safe. And yet he is a huge proponent for it. So when he made that, and when the tribe came out saying that they were not in support of that, he just said, well, I'm not going to do my political fundraisers at Bois Fort Resort anymore. And until you get it straight and you come back and you say you support this, this mine, I'm not going to do my political fundraisers there. I mean, it backfired on him because everybody in the community was like, what do you mean you're going to boycott Fortune Bay? Like, that employs my family, that employs my neighbors, that employs like everybody. And how can you say you're going to boycott a place that is our livelihood? And so I think that like it depends, like yes, like you have to kind of understand the issues and you have to understand your community. You have to understand the relationships between the tribes and the communities. And I would say that those alliances just, I mean, there are so many opportunities to build upon those alliances and to strengthen them.
And real quick, some folks have put some questions in the chat. We're going to get to those right after this follow-up question. So if you have questions for Nevada, please place those in the chat and we'll try to get to as many as possible in about the next 10-15 minutes here. But you mentioned there at the end, Nevada, there's so many opportunities for these alliances to occur. Can you brought up the mining, stopping mining, and Jane talks about the oil pipeline. What other opportunities exist for predominantly rural white communities partnering with tribal nations or other communities of colors in rural America?
Yeah, great question. Well, also right now there is, it's called Lutsen Ski Resort. They're trying to expand and they're up near Grand Portage Tribe on the North Shore of Lake Superior. And what we have in place between Fond du Lac Tribe, Bois Forte Tribe, and Grand Portage Tribe is the Treaty of 1854. And so that treaty allows for tribal members from those nations to hunt and gather in the ceded territory. And the Lutsen Ski Resort is in that ceded territory. And so they want to do this big expansion, but they have to go through a review process where the tribes are brought into that. I mean, there are folks in the community that just say, well, we don't need to stop development of this ski resort based on Native people's maybe future use of that land that we don't even know what it will be. And, we gave them those rights or something. I think the concept around treaty rights is just something that is not understood by a lot of people. They don't understand that, no, it was tribal nations who gave you all rights to land. And that's what the treaties allow, is the rights that you have were granted by the treaty. The treaty was the thing that made the agreement the supreme law of the land. And so in this case that's happening right now, you just see a lot of tribal members and community members stepping up and talking about that, like talking about treaty rights and helping people, like this business leader who said this very ignorant comment, and it was in the paper, a lot of people coming forward to say, that's not actually accurate, and here's what is accurate related to this. And so I just think that there's ways. So much of the problem, I think, has to do with the fact that we didn't learn this history. Like most of us have never learned this history around what is a treaty in Minnesota, even though maybe we've studied like state and local law or federal law. We've never really understood that we're also under treaty law, and what does that mean? So I think, again, just like really understanding, if you're near a tribal nation, to get to know, who that nation is, their people, and then what treaties you all are governed under, is a really helpful thing.
And that is a good challenge for me personally, being an educator of middle school social studies, ensuring that true history is being exposed to our students. And Omaha is named after a Native tribe, and so making sure those voices are being lifted up. So thank you for that. Leslie submitted a question, and so Leslie, we're going to get you your mic turned on so that you can ask your question.
Yes, hi. I've noticed for a long time that when you say politics to people in the US, they tend to think, oh, it's president. And I've found when I go out and I canvass for local candidates, I'll get people saying to me things like, well, I don't want to vote for either one of them. And I realize they're talking about the presidential candidates, and they're not even aware of who their local candidates are. So my question was just a general one about, I really admire your career, having been so focused on the local. But how do we, even in urban areas, how do we convince people of the primacy of local politics?
Yeah, I mean, it really is about the conversations you're having, Leslie, as you go out and you do the door knocking and like helping folks to understand that they're real people on the ballots. And I do think that sometimes the word politics or politicians like isolates us from, it's an isolating term. And I know when I was running, I never called myself a politician. I still don't, I would never even describe my 10 years on the council that I was a politician. I talk about myself as an elected leader and someone who is representing the community and the community's interests. And so when I go out to have conversations with people, when I was out door knocking, I wanted people to really understand that I'm not there. I'm there to serve the community's interests and to lift up their voices. And so if they have an issue, that they should know that they can come to me and talk to me about that. I'm going to listen to them, and then I'm going to bring that forward. And even like, I mean, there were times where I brought things forward that it wasn't something that I necessarily agreed to or thought was like a good idea, but because someone asked me to do it, I still brought it forward and said, look, someone in the community raised this issue with me. They want it to be brought forward and they want it to be heard. And now like, I'm like, let's talk about it. And, we wouldn't always, we didn't necessarily land at that as a solution, but at least those people in community would come back and say, thank you. Like you did make my voice heard. And you did bring up the issue that I care about into a space that I don't think I ever would have had anyone, saying anything for me. So I think, there's a difference, it depends on like who you are and how you're approaching this type of work. But I think it's important for people to understand that it's that elected leaders are real people and that they are there to represent you. And if they're a good elected leader, they're going to do that. They're going to listen, and then they're going to bring your issues forward.
Thank you, Leslie, for your question and your response to Nevada. Jamel, I believe you have the next one.
Yeah, just really quickly. I mean, when you tell people, I really like your side when people say, "Hey, we need this community? We need your community. Go deliver them for us." And you say, "I can't do that. You have to do your own work." Do they do it, or do they just kind of evaporate after they've asked you? And what happens?
I think the question then is like, they often will say, I don't know how. Right. And so if they say that, I'm like, well, how do you reach, if you're trying to engage teachers around a school board issue, how do you engage those teachers? And they'll say, oh, well, we find a list, we figure out who they are. We come up with a plan, we call them, we figure out who knows somebody on the list, and we get started in that way. Like they usually know how to like address other kinds of groups of people, but for whatever reason, I mean, it's because of systemic racism, right? Like that's why it's like, well, I don't know how to talk to Native people, or I don't know how to talk to Black people, or I don't know how to talk to Asian American people or Somali people. But it really is like, you take the same approach in terms of how do you like learn about where people are at in their community, and then start to go have conversations and learn more. And some people do it, Jamal, some people don't do it, right? Some people will come back to me multiple times with the same thing, and I'm like, I've already told you, I'm not doing that for you. And there are ways you can do that you need to be building that for yourself. I'd be interested in hearing what your experience has been.
No, I think that it's just, your response is the right response, because so many people in different communities, sometimes they kind of take it upon themselves, like they'll be the only point of contact. They get burned out, they get frustrated, and their relationship with their community. Well, okay, here comes, let's suppose that every time they asked you, you said, okay, yes, I will go. here comes Nevada again. She's, somebody's asked her to do X or somebody's asked her to do Y. That's not great. I just think that your response is great. And I think that your coaching is great. It's just a nice eye opener for me. So I'm gonna start thinking that way too.
I mean, Jamel, like, thank you for sharing more, because I think in Minneapolis, especially in the last, 2 years, has been incredibly challenging. Like, we had the COVID come. Minnesota's already has the worst disparities in the country around education disparities, economic disparities, health disparities. I mean, and this is, where Minnesota loves to brag about itself and how great we are with our Fortune 500 companies and our wonderful education systems. It's only great for certain people. And the disparity between those that achieve at this very high level and others is just, it's astronomical. And we, I've been doing this work for a long time and putting a spotlight around these disparities. But I think when COVID happened, and then when George Floyd was murdered, that just broke the whole thing open in Minnesota. And like everything in Minnesota changed almost like this. And it was like work I had been doing my entire life to get people to think about these things and to work on them, suddenly was just blown up in everybody's face. And I would say that during that time, especially, I was getting calls like twice a week, 3 times a week from people asking me to come in and do something related to racial equity, to help them understand it, to explain it to them, to basically to just do all this work. And I mean, I got good at saying no. I mean, that's the one thing. And I got good at like telling people, you've got to do your own work, because you cannot, I'm already doing my work and I'm going to have to try to do the work that for you, like, no way, like this, that's not an acceptable ask for you to come to me and ask me those things when I'm also dealing with trauma, like in the community, on top of just the work that's happening. So I don't know. I think I got better at it in the last couple of years, and also an important learning process and growth process for myself.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jamel and Nevada, for that conversation. And, and so you had shared when we first talked a couple of weeks ago, that you had lived in, more northern rural Minnesota, and then you have made the choice to come to Minneapolis, an urban area, to live and work. And so as you kind of have transitioned between those two spaces, as you're interacting with, folks now more in an urban environment, Jane talks a lot about how we have stereotypes. And so what stereotypes have you heard as you work in a more urban setting about rural America and or indigenous communities?
Well, I mean, first of all,
and actually, sorry, I should stop, because I don't want us to repeat the stereotypes, because we all know them. But how do you?
I was gonna flip it on its head a little bit.
Okay, good.
From the Iron Range perspective, like the way that we talked about urban people is what I would hear frequently was people would just call them cityots. They're cityots, and they don't know anything about our area. And then from the Iron Range perspective, like we have a reputation in the state for being really gritty and hardscrabble and really direct, probably more direct than the traditional sort of Minnesota nice, passive aggressive Minnesotan. Iron Rangers are a lot more in your face and will tell you kind of straight out like what they're thinking, which is like, it's a mixed bag. So I think that like understanding, like that there are things that go both ways related to the way that people think about people who live in the city, and then and vice versa. So the second part of your question was?
Yeah, so just hearing, knowing that, and just like how have you worked to kind of bridge that divide now that you're living in an urban space?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've always really come from a rural perspective, even living here. And so what I've always tried to do is like bring that perspective forward, and but not just thinking about like rural, I'm also thinking about tribal perspective, and then how do we intersect with urban. And for me, I think it is a little different because I am a Leech Lake citizen. I know that like this is indigenous land, you know, and that particularly northern Minnesota is my homelands, like straight up, literally my homelands. I don't have another place that I come from. I come from this place. And so when I think about urban, rural, and tribal, I mean, I know that they're all different things, but the truth is that we as Anishinaabe people belong in this place. It doesn't matter what it is, what it is. And so we do have a very, I mean, Minneapolis has like, I think it's like second largest urban Native population in the country. And we know that Native people go between these communities, between their tribal community, they might live in a small town, they might live in like a mid-sized city like Duluth, and then they might live in the Twin Cities. But most Native families kind of understand that they have a presence between these different things. And so I don't know, like from my perspective, I think about it probably primarily from that I come from a rural perspective, but then also the other lens is that I am an Anishinaabe person, and that it's important for me to have relationships in all of these places because I have people in all of these places, and that we are connected, you know, and we depend on each other. I think for myself coming into the urban community, but I just hadn't like really like understood fully because I spent my whole life in northern Minnesota, is like how many resources are in the urban community. And you hear that, you know, you hear that, but it's different like when you're actually here and you can see how many there are so many resources in the urban community that are just different in terms of jobs, in terms of access to things, in terms of just ideas, in terms of just other people and other like I think of like the cultural assets here are, I feel like I'm in such a rich place because like I live in a community that's so diverse and has so much cultural richness that is different than, I mean, the Iron Range will pride itself on the fact that it was an immigrant community and that there was such diversity on the Iron Range. But when people talk about that story of the Iron Range, they're really talking about European immigrants, right? And it is a story that people hold on to pretty tight up there. They don't talk a lot about Native people. I mean, I think that's changing a little bit now. They're adding Native people due to pressure, I think, by myself and others, that we need to be talking more about the original people. But I think that in Minneapolis and St. Paul, it's a very culturally rich community, and that also is a resource that I didn't fully understand until like to be in it.
And as someone who has lived in Minneapolis for 2 years, just short 2 years, that Minnesota passive aggressiveness is real. And so really just appreciate your true raw answers tonight, and thankful that there are Minnesotans who can just kind of tell it how it is sometimes. Because I experienced that passive aggressive Minnesota nice part. And so as we wrap up here, because I want to honor our time commitment that we talked about, you know, so if you could, what would be the number one thing you would challenge all of us in this virtual space tonight? What would you challenge us on? And maybe just share the biggest learning experience you have had as you've gone throughout your many years of political activism.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's like a challenge, but it's something I'm thinking a lot about. I mean, I think it is a challenge, but like right now I'm working on the Page Amendment, which is an education policy. We're working to change the Constitution, our state constitution, and upgrade our education provision to make sure that all children have access to a quality public education, and that we're centering children and that we're giving them a civil right to this public education. And interestingly, in this campaign, we have BIPOC Democrats, so Black, Indigenous, people of color Democrats, and rural Republicans who are working together to get this policy passed. And so if there's a challenge, I mean, I think it's a challenge for everyone right now because we're in such a polarized time. But if there's a challenge, it's like, how do we really work across and truly bridge, not just the rural and urban divide, but like, how do we start bridging some of those political divides as well? And it's not, I won't say that I have a solution for it because I'm challenged by it myself, but I think figuring out how to have conversations and to get to like the heart and the values of the things that we really care about to start working towards solutions rather than continuing to have this really destructive, these destructive like political battles. Yeah, and the other thing, I mean, I've been working with, like, I do a lot of work around BIPOC farmers and, you know, like land reparations, like land back reparations, those kinds of things. And working with BIPOC farmers, I've been brought in to work with a group of rural white farmers who are very interested also in understanding how do they start thinking differently and how did they start doing that work. So it's great when you actually can find a group of people who want to really do that work because it's not easy work, and that they've created their own cohort of rural white farmers that are working on racial equity issues and land issues specifically, because we know that something like, I want to say like 72% of the land in Minnesota will change hands in the next like 20 years. And this is our farmland. And so like there are people who are actively thinking about what does that mean in terms of equity in the future. And so I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's always easy to find the people, but if you can start, you know, small and build that out, I think that there's a lot of ways to bridge things and to work for really transformational change. And, you know, if you had asked me a year ago, because a year ago I was working on the Biden-Harris campaign, right? Like we were just like one day away from winning Minnesota because it's election eve tonight. Last year I was in a much different place in my mind than I am right now. But if you had asked me if I'd be working with rural Republicans in Minnesota to pass transformational education policy, I wouldn't have believed it, right? Like I wouldn't have believed that that was true or could be possible, but it is, and that's happening. So I guess that would be the challenge, and I think it's a challenge for everybody.
I love that. And I think that's a great reminder for us all is there are commonalities and we can find them if we're willing to invite them, everyone to the table and listen. And I wrote down, you know, really get to the heart and the values of each other rather than the distractions that we often hear on social media or in you know, just in general. So I really love that piece. And I did put in the chat a link to learn more just about the Page Amendment if you're curious to know of the work that Nevada is on. But Nevada, thank you so much for sharing your perspective tonight. We really enjoyed hearing from you, and I'm excited to stay connected because I know you're doing a lot of amazing work with rural America. So just appreciate your passion and your desire to stand up for yourself, for your children, for your tribe, and also just for the whole state of Minnesota and our country. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Really happy to be here tonight.
Thank you. Have a good night, Nevada.